From coast to coast and around the world, it's time to praise the Lord.
Praise the Lord, let every nation rejoice. Praise the Lord with one mighty voice.
Praise the Lord covers the major Christian events in America and across the world, from the heart of Europe to the tip of Africa. From the centers of Asia to Central and South America. You're a part of the world's largest prayer and praise gathering. Joining us from Trinity Music City in Nashville, Tennessee are, from the movie God's Not Dead, actors Paul Guo, Ben Ochieng, and Adele Situ. Also, Dr. Brian Miller, Dr. Adrian Warnock, Dr. Ming Wang, and Ilea Sheree. Ready to take your calls, prayer partners from around America.
Praise the Lord, let every nation rejoice. Praise the Lord with one mighty voice. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord,
Now your host, Senior Pastor of Bethel World Outreach Church, Rice Brown.
Well, we're talking about the movie God's Not Dead. The theme of tonight's show is God's Not Dead, the movie. There's a book by a friend of mine. No, it's my book, God's Not Dead. Really what happened was I was telling a friend named Troy Duhan about writing this book. He picked up the phone and called the company Pureflix and said, my friend Rice Brooks is writing this book. They flew here to Tennessee. We talked about the possibility of a movie and what it might be like. Came out to California, and we were engaging college students at UCLA, and came up with this drama of a young college student challenged by his atheist professor to prove that God exists. And so I was fortunate to be able to help not only kind of the concept, but also lay out arguments. What would you say if you were challenged to prove that God exists? Well, in the last segment, we heard from 3 of the actors from the movie, and I have a very august group of experts here. I want to introduce to you Dr. Brian Miller. Dr. Miller is a physicist who went to MIT in undergrad, his PhD in physics from Duke. We have Dr. Adrian Warnock from Great Britain, the mother country. He's a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, and a prolific blogger. If you're a Christian minister, you need to go to adrianwarnock.com. And everywhere I go, people think I'm famous because he mentions me on his blog. But Adrian, what a prolific writer you are, and very connected to the body of Christ, to the church, not only in Europe, but here in America. And then, of course, our resident expert of TBN, Dr. Ming Wang. Dr. Wang, interesting, not only is he a medical doctor from Harvard, PhD in laser physics, attended MIT as well, but an eye surgeon, a world-renowned eye surgeon, over 55,000 eye procedures. Really, Dr. Wang, when you've been on here before, you're flooded with emails. I think, 86 countries emailed you. I have to tell the story of a woman watching this show in Morocco with blindness in one eye, losing her sight in the other. Here's Dr. Wang and sees stories of him in his clinic here, the Wang Institute, reversing blindness. And she flies to here, flies to Tennessee, and you're able to save her sight. But welcome all these 3 gentlemen tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Let me start with you, Adrian. You're right in the middle. You've traveled the furthest to be with us. You saw the movie. In fact, I sent you a link to the movie. You're a psychiatrist, you're a medical doctor, and we're going to talk in this segment about the credibility of the presentation in the classrooms of this young man defending the existence of God. So what were some of your reflections on as you just kind of saw the movie from just a scientific standpoint?
Well, I think, you know, for anyone who's been at university, there's the same sort of ideas are there, you know. Certainly for me, I remember sitting in ethics classes particularly where one of the professors was clearly very anti the faith. It's a bit of an irony, isn't it, that in the ethics class, that was when I felt most assaulted for my faith. Wasn't as bad as is in the movie, clearly, but I think that kind of experience is quite common for everyone. And I think for a lot of people, when a movie touches something that is real to them in some way, even if it's in a much smaller way, many movies answer that what if question. You know, what if your professor was an atheist? What if he was that severe on you? And you may not have had that level of severity, but because you've had it in a smaller way, you identify with it and you go, yes, you know what? I felt a bit like Josh. I felt uncertain. I felt afraid. I felt, should I share my faith? And I've certainly felt that way at work as well. You sort of think, well, people are very hostile here. Is it right to talk about my faith, or is it wise to keep quiet, or am I just afraid? And those kind of tumult of emotions, really, I think were very, very real for most of the people. And certainly when I watched it in a movie theatre, I've never been in a movie where there was more crying, laughing, and gasps at various points. Clearly people were very emotionally engaged at a very deep level.
Yeah. Now, just Dr. Wang, your reflections, because we went together. So, what was your from a scientist standpoint, watching a presentation? Many times people default to just emotional experience. In fact, critics will say Christianity is just an emotional thing, and you know, if you don't feel it, then it's not real. But yet, didn't you sense there was more to this than emotion?
Yes, I think what defines a great movie are three criteria. Number one, has a message. And the message is very clear. There is clear evidence proving the existence of God. And second, connection. And movie has to produce wide enough spectrum of characters, emotions, social, economic backgrounds, and ethnic background that many people can connect to. And this movie has succeeded in that. And number three is transformation. That in the beginning of the movie, these characters, through the events in the movie, their lives got transformed. Together with them, the audience, their lives have been transformed. So it's the message, the connection, and the transformation. And this movie, God's Not Dead, met all three.
Now, I have to say that Paul Kuo, the Chinese actor who played a Chinese student who came to America and is hearing this debate in class, was inspired by me telling the screenwriters about you, because you came from China to Harvard University and came to faith at Harvard because of the witness of a professor. So it wasn't exactly that same portrayal, but yet it was kind of inspired by your characters. That had to be fun seeing Paul.
Oh, he's better, much better looking.
But just talk a little bit about your own story, that you came to Harvard as an atheist and what happened.
I think one of the most powerful arguments in this movie is win in their own game. Scientists are known for the logics, being rational. So this movie stayed with logic, stayed with reasoning, and at the end proved through logic the favorite tools of scientists and the atheists that they like to use logics, and prove actually logically there are evidence of existence of God. So that kind of connect to my own experience at Harvard. I was in the intellectual powerhouse studying there, but of course majority of these professors and students are atheists. They don't believe in the existence of God. They believe only in science and technology. And I was one as well. I believe solely in the power of science, and I believe science could answer all the questions in the world. But in the process of studying, something unexpected happened. The more science I studied, more unknowns I have. For example, the structure of human eye, human brain, so complicated, so complex, it is hard to fathom that it could come from random evolution, even in a short span of 13 billion years. The universe purported to exist. It would have taken trillions of years. So I was in crisis. My gung-ho scientific mind that could not answer those questions. So at that time, a professor, someone I respect greatly, a pediatric professor, I respect him medically, he saw an opportunity in this young man who believed only in science, but he was in crisis. So he took me out lunch and he said, "What's across the street?" I said, "There's a car." He said, "What's the difference between car and human brain?" I said, "Human brain is a lot more complicated." And I said, "Can a random part of metals assemble itself into a car?" I said, "No way." He said, "How about human brain?" From then, I realized that in my life, there's a new door opened, a new window into a new level of understanding of life itself. I've come to realize that science answers the question what things are, and faith answers the question why things are.
Excellent. Brian, there you are, our resident physicist. I love Brian. He travels with me many times and works in our office, so if ever I have any kind of question that I'm stumped with, it's great to have a physicist on staff. Brian, you went to MIT, went to Duke. First of all, I want you to talk about your reflections in the movie, and then there's 3 classroom scenes, and really there's 3 primary arguments for God that are presented in the movie. Number 1, that the universe began, that the fact that there was a beginning points to the need for a cause. The logical argument, if I had a whiteboard here, a chalkboard, it would go like this: everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe, premise 2, began to exist, and that's a fact, that the universe had a definite beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. The universe has a cause. So that logical syllogism, but yet it hinges on the fact that the universe began. So talk about your reflections in the movie and just your reflections on the science of that and how the beginning points to God.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting because I really resonated in the movie in a couple different ways. One is I was a product of what happens when there isn't a Josh in the classroom. Because when I was in high school, I had a very powerful encounter with God just reading the Bible. But when I went to MIT, I took a class on the Bible that was taught by.
What about you took a class at MIT on the Bible?
Yeah, they have a course called Course 21, which includes all the humanities.
Oh,
so they do have them. So I took a course on the Bible because I was a young Christian wanting to learn more. And what happened was that, and this is what's really important to realize, because people say, well, professors are never like that. They don't make you sign papers, and it's true, but it's a lot more subtle. What they'll do is they say, we're going to look at the evidence objectively. And when they say objectively, what they really mean is through the lens of an atheist. So what happened to me and what happens to many students is they'll go to a classroom and the professor says, why don't you look at the world through my lens or my view that God doesn't exist? And that's what I did, is I put on the atheist lens, and when I looked at the Bible, I became pretty convinced it wasn't true. And I also at that time read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. And Richard Dawkins, he was arguing that the appearance of design in nature is just an illusion, and that, in fact, we're simply the product of the blind forces of nature. So what happened is I went wanting to serve God, but because of the intellectual attacks that I received, I became convinced that Christianity was just a psychological crutch, that it just wasn't true. And for me, what happened is I just went to my room and I said, God, if you're real, just show me what's true, because I can't just believe this blindly. I have to know. And that put me on a very long journey where I read books like the books that Josh was reading for his class. And what I realized is that the evidence that was presented against the Christian faith wasn't objective, but it was actually biased, and it ignored the facts that supported the Christian faith. And what I realized is when you see the evidence in its entirety, the conclusion is that there is a God, He created us, and that Jesus Christ is real and rose from the dead.
So I guess what you're saying is you can look at little snapshots of things and hyper-focus on that, but when you look at the cumulative case for God and for the Christian faith, it's overwhelming, and that's really one of the criterion. Adrian, why don't you pick this up? We'll come back. I'm going to pick up on the beginning of the universe, but you're a psychiatrist, a medical doctor. You're also a Christian minister. When people say to you that the Christian faith is an emotional crutch, Sigmund Freud saying it's wish fulfillment. We want there to be a God there, versus what many times atheism is it's a wish fulfillment that they don't want Him to be there because of the accountability. How do you respond to that charge as a psychiatrist, as a scientist, that the Christian faith is simply an emotional crutch?
Well, I think it's quite an interesting charge, and for some people perhaps it is. But I think one of the things about Christianity, it does give us something to lean on. I think the fact of the matter is that if there is no solidity in Christianity, then we're all without hope. And I think that's one of the challenges for people who have no faith, is that the Bible talks about people with no faith being without hope and without God in the world. And there's no doubt that one of the fundamental needs in the human heart is for hope. If you take hope away from people, it's very disruptive. Now, of course, you could say, well, what if that hope is false? What if that hope is a delusion? Well, of course, as Christians, we believe that the hope is not false. We believe that the hope is true. And so I think clearly you as a Christian need to look at the evidence. Look at the evidence for the existence of God. Look at the evidence for the resurrection. Look at the evidence that all this is true. And there are many people, of course, who far from wanting to believe that God is real, actually don't want to believe that God is real. I'm thinking of perhaps the most famous example of all being the Apostle Paul, great persecutor of the faith. The last thing that he wanted was for God to encounter him on Damascus and to say, what are you doing? You're attacking me. So, and there are many stories like that throughout history where people who are going completely the other way and there's no trace of a desire for them to believe in God, encounter God for themselves and realize they were wrong.
Now, you wrote a fantastic book, Raised with Christ, How the Resurrection Changes Everything. Isn't that the subtitle? Talk about just, I mean, the movie doesn't give all of the evidence for the resurrection. It really centers on, you know, the evidence in terms of the beginning of the universe, the origin of life, and evil and suffering. But yet you hear in the discussions around with all the different characters, the Christian faith is obviously, the gospel is preached, the resurrection. But what is that? How does that evidence of the resurrection, how do you know that that's real, and how would you explain that that's real to someone?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, I think there are levels, isn't there? And the first question is there a God? And if we come to the conclusion, yes, there is, the next question is, well, what's he like? And of course, the Christian God is very different to the God of any other religion in the world, in that we believe in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And we believe that if you want to see what God is like, the place to look is in Jesus. And Jesus demonstrates his Godhead in many different ways, by how he was, by the miracles he performed, but most of all, really, by his death and his resurrection. And of course, the resurrection of Jesus is what proves that he is God. It was what proves that he was able to conquer death. And it gives us our hope, if you're looking at the hope issue, that we have a hope that because Jesus rose from the dead, we too will one day rise from the dead, and we will be with him. We won't just lay in the ground, and we won't just float in the sky in some kind of ethereal way as well. We will have a new body, a spiritual body, that will be able to be with him forever. So the evidence for the resurrection is absolutely critical, really, because the one thing that defines Christianity is that belief. I mean, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
And I think Christianity unequivocally says that if this event did not happen, then this is not true. I mean, no other religions puts it all on one event.
That's right.
No other miracle in any other religion would say, well, if this miracle or story or legend or tale didn't happen. But Christianity, Paul said, if the resurrection didn't happen, then our faith is in vain. Mm-hmm. One of the central charges that you're going to hear, and I've already seen it and heard it on the internet, is the movie God's Not Dead is out there, and then the atheists are saying, oh, what evidence do you have? Here comes another, blind faith movie and some kind of, it's, again, insults are not arguments. And when you get past the insults to real arguments and you really want to have a dialogue, then I think we can begin to maybe get closer to understanding each other. But I want you to answer, Doctor. We again have three. Dr. Wang is a world-renowned eye surgeon. Dr. Adrian Warnock is a psychiatrist from Great Britain. And Dr. Brian Miller is a physicist from MIT and Duke. So when you hear the charge, and I want to start with you, Ming, and go down the row. When you hear the charge that somehow Christians just want to assume God is the answer to everything, it's called the God of the gaps. So if we don't know an answer, if we don't know something, we just say God did it, and it stifles research, it stifles science. That's almost just an insult when I know the lives of you three men and your research. So how would you answer someone who says that Christianity and faith in God is the enemy of reason?
I think, first of all, we do have a choice. This is well demonstrated in this movie, that each of the students has a choice. They have choice to open their mind to look at the evidence of the existence of God. And the second, I think another powerful thing in the movie, which I think is one of the most significant aspects of this movie, is at the end that the students show that how can the atheist professor hate something that he does not even believe they exist to begin with. So I think...
How can you hate someone if they don't exist?
That's right. So this pointed out a very important aspect, I think Dr. Miller pointed out early, that is the atheistic approach is not fair, not objective. It's biased to begin with. And with regard to science and faith, I believe that we can find things to work together. I mean, just because sometimes things do appear to be clashes, stem cell, fetal tissue, and ethical, moral issues, and also the need to develop stem cell fetal tissue research to improve our treatment for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, macular degeneration. So faith and science do appear to be clashes. There's no doubt about it. But I do believe God wants us to continue persist, and there is a way.
Yeah, and in fact, your research has been very telling, because when the ethics of we need the stem cells, but we don't want to hurt the baby, so you invented a way, or you discovered a way to take the stem cells from the placenta of the mother after having had the child, and use those stem cells to actually do the job so you didn't have to hurt the baby. So again, but it was through research. It wasn't through just blindly saying, well, I'm a Christian now, so I don't have to research. I mean, that's, my kids, I homeschool my children, and when they bring me a math problem and say, well, what's the answer? They can't put Jesus in the answer. No, you have to find the answer to the math problem. Now, we can give God the honor for the overall complexity and mathematical order of the universe, but there's still an answer. And as Christians, Adrian, we are called to use our mind. I mean, you are a research scientist, so how do you respond when people say Christianity is the enemy of reason?
Well, I think if you look back at the history of science, there's no doubt that science itself really was inspired by this search for truth, and the belief that there was a truth to find and that there was an order in the universe was very much inspired by the idea that there was a God who made order in the first place. And so the search for truth is very much the search of the human, really, whether you're doing scientific search for truth or whether you're searching for the God who made it all. And so for me, I think it's important that we realize that our intellect is no enemy of faith, that we are to look for the truth. So just as it matters whether or not a drug exists, it matters whether or not God exists. You know, whether or not a drug works, it matters whether or not God exists. It matters whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. It matters, and so we must find out the answer. It's interesting that, of course, one of the writers of the New Testament was actually a medical doctor. So clearly the science in his mind didn't hinder.
So in other words, when you do pharmacological research and you're trying to see whether a drug being proposed is going to work or be valid, or is it going to hurt, I mean, that research is vital to know that this has integrity. And so in the same way, our search for God can't be casual, because it's not just that there's a God there, but you know, what specifically is this God like?
And it's striking to me, actually, how many people make their decision about this vital question, is there a God, on such flimsy evidence. They've never really examined it. So they might be a real person of faith, but it's really because they've always been a person of faith, or they've grown up, or maybe they had some kind of experience. There's nothing wrong with that, but they've never actually stopped and looked at the evidence for themselves. But equally, I mean, you know, many people don't go to church, but they still believe in God. And you ask them, well, why do you believe in God? Or why don't you believe in God? And they've never really looked at it.
So the movie we're talking about is God's Not Dead. It's opened in this past weekend, 750 theaters, to packed audiences, to cheers, to tears. People are telling their friends, they're taking, and not just their church groups, but people are bringing skeptical friends and saying, at least we have a conversation now based on a movie. They may not come to church, but they'll come to a theater to watch a movie. In this scene, in this drama, a young student is challenged by his atheist professor to prove God exists. Shane Harper is the actor who plays the student. He's from Disney Channel fame. Kevin Sorbo, who's become a friend. Kevin, who portrayed Hercules in the TV series, the long-standing TV series, plays the atheist professor. It's very dramatic. And there's 3 primary classroom scenes that discuss the evidence for God. The first classroom scene talks about the beginning of the universe, and the fact that the universe did begin points to God. Brian, you're a physicist, MIT, a graduate, as well as Duke, a PhD in physics. How did that strike you, watching that scene, in terms of, is that real evidence that God exists, talking about the fact that the universe began?
What's really interesting about the movie is I now, as you mentioned, will travel to universities and speak to students, and often professors will come who are atheists. And a lot of the discussions in the movie were the same dialogues I would have on the campus. So it was extremely realistic. And what's really interesting is you had mentioned the God of the gaps. And if you look historically, the idea of the God...
Meaning this is the argument skeptics use, that Christians or people of faith just insert God if they don't understand something rather than research.
Right, and what happens is the God of the gaps applies to the everyday laws of physics. Like back in the day, like Newton would look at the way the stars would move or planets would move. And he made the mistake of, when he couldn't explain it, he'd say, well, maybe God was doing that. And what we realized is eventually it wasn't God's direct intervention in very crass ways, but it was the laws of physics. However, what people who make that argument don't realize is that whenever scientists recognize that there's a creator behind all of science, it pushes science forward. And whenever they deny that creator, it holds science back. So for instance, to do science, as was mentioned, you have to assume that the world is orderly, and you have to assume that we have the ability to understand that order. Now, if our brains just evolved to eat better, to flee, to reproduce, why would the brain evolve to understand quantum mechanics? That makes no sense. So atheists, when they do science, they have to borrow Christian assumptions. Also, what's happened is you had mentioned the Big Bang, and the whole idea of that is that the universe had a beginning. And as you mentioned, that means there had to be a creator outside of time and space, essentially the God of the Bible.
So if at the Big Bang, if we use the terminology of science, time and space came into existence, then the cause of that would have to be spaceless and timeless.
Exactly right. And what's interesting is atheists tried to resist the acceptance of the Big Bang because of its theological implications. Also, what happened, as scientists started to study the laws of physics, what they realized is the laws of physics were designed with life in mind. Because if gravity were a little bit stronger or a little bit weaker, we wouldn't have planets. We wouldn't have any way to support life. If the force that hold the electron to the proton were stronger or weaker, we wouldn't have life.
Let me just set this up. Just imagine you had a universe starter kit, like a soundboard on your, and if you go to church or a concert, you see knobs that you're controlling the sound. And let's imagine that you have a knob for gravity or the strong or weak nuclear force or entropy. In other words, there are these forces or these constants of nature from the very beginning that if they are not fine-tuned exactly and all of them line up, then you don't have a life-permitting universe. Meaning that if there's too much, if you have a gravity knob on your universe starter kit and you put too much gravity, then the universe doesn't get out of the gate. If you have too little, then things don't form. So that precision. What does an atheist conclude when they see that precision? What do they default to?
Here's what's interesting, is the obvious conclusion is that there is a creator that had us in mind. So the atheist doesn't want to accept that, so they imagine that there's an infinite number of universes which sort of go through all possible ranges of forces. Now, what's important to realize is that's based on blind faith. Now, you'll hear someone like a Lawrence Krauss, you'll hear even Stephen Hawkins make these comments of how science is starting to go in that direction, but what they really mean is that their imaginations are going in that direction. There is no empirical evidence to support any of it. It's pure blind faith. But beyond just the fact that our universe was designed for life, we see evidence that there was a creator involved in the unfolding of our universe. So for instance, the planet Earth. Even with a life-permitting universe, you would never get an Earth-like planet by chance, because it's the right distance from the sun, the right tilt, the right rotation rate. We have plate tectonics, we recycle minerals. Our moon stabilizes our orbit. And in fact, people like Hugh Ross have identified about 800 parameters that have to be right for us to support life on Earth and our universe. So what we see is even with 1 trillion universes like our own, you would never get an Earth-like planet if God did not only start the universe just right, but shape the formation of our planet. Also, when you look at the origin of life, and my specialty is what's called complex systems and nonlinear dynamics. So that deals specifically.
Say that slowly because some of us mortals have to hear that again.
My specialty in science is called complex systems and nonlinear dynamics.
Nonlinear dynamics.
Right.
Okay, you got. Okay,
And just to see why it's important is that's the specific area of physics which deals with the issue of origin of life. Because what you have to realize is when you look at a cell could not come about without a designer. And the reason for that is that nature wants to take things from high order to high disorder. Like, is it easier to keep your room messy or to keep your room neat? Obviously, it's easier to keep it messy. Also, nature wants to go from high energy to low energy. And that's all encapsulated in this technical term called free energy. We don't have to worry about what that means. But the point is, a cell has high order and high energy. Nature wants to take a cell and break it into little itty-bitty pieces of low energy chemicals. So what that means is nature would never create a cell, it can only break it down. Now what's interesting is that if you read atheist websites, what they'll say is, oh, but maybe the energy from the sun can come into Earth, it's an open system, and maybe that energy can create the order of the cell. And it's obvious that people that say that haven't studied non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Because that's like arguing that if you set the drapes of your room on fire, the energy of your drapes burning could make your room neat. Obviously, that would never happen, but that's pretty much what scientists are saying. So what they do is, instead of accepting the obvious conclusion that the cell is designed, like you mentioned before, the idea of information, you can't create information from nature, it has to be the product of the mind. They deny the obvious and make claims that are completely unscientific. So what you see is that what they're doing is they're making claims that are pseudoscientific claims driven by ideology instead of accepting the facts of science.
And I think that's an important distinction right there, because we love science. Science, again, rose out of a Christian worldview that the universe was ordered and understandable. It's the belief of scientism which says science can answer everything. Science has a wonderful place in our world, but science cannot answer the ultimate questions of life. And really, science itself can't even prove itself, because really, what empirical data in a laboratory demonstrates your proposition that science answers everything? So that's a philosophical statement. So when Stephen Hawking, very famous scientist, in his book The Grand Design, and we mentioned this, and it's mentioned in the movie, that philosophy is dead, it's a frustration that, he knows philosophy can't answer, or that science can't answer things. He's trying to dismiss philosophy, but that itself is a philosophical statement. Now, without me getting too involved in this, because I want to ask the questions, Dr. Wang, when you're an eye surgeon, Darwin himself was perplexed with the eye. I mean, the complexity of the eye, the parts all have to be there. It's a term I've learned, it's called irreducible complexity, that in order to have sight, you have to have all of these components, the optic nerve, the retina, the cornea. When you look at the eye, 55,000 eye procedures, how does the order and the intricacy of the eye point to God, or does it point away from God?
That was the very first evidence, or very first reason that I began to doubt my original, the belief that I was born as atheist, that I believe only in science. As I was studying the anatomy of human eyes, seeing the photoreceptors, the ganglion cells, the neuronal connections, and I realized that the complexity involving the entire arrangement of vision capturing and interpretation is so complex that is unfathomable that it could evolve from random. In fact, I look at the number of years the universe is purported to have existed, which is 13 billion years, and I just calculated that how long would it take for random cell assembly, and giving all the random choices will assemble in the neuronal and the retina and photoreceptor cells, and I realized that it would take probably trillions of years. So it could not be possible for the entire lifetime of the universe to evolve just the structure of human eye. In fact, if you look at the neuronal connections, the neuronal synapses in one person's brain, say in your brain or my brain, the one person's brain, the number of neuronal synapses, the neuron connections, is equal to the number of all the stars that we have ever discovered in the entire universe. So the very complexity of the biological system, such as human eyes, is the strongest evidence of the existence of God or intelligent design.
Excellent. Paul Kuo, now your actor in this show is very much a centerpiece. A person who basically comes to university from China. In fact, the opening scene when you tell them where you're from, the PRC, the little girl at orientation doesn't know what that is.
Yeah.
So just talk. I mean, what an enormous part you played in this movie, and I think an inspirational part to many.
Well, I mean, it's definitely an honor. Like I still can't believe I'm actually in this movie and doing this. Like watching myself up on screen, it's kind of surreal. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, like when I first saw the script and the side, I mean, I actually grew up as a Christian. So I grew up here, mostly in the U.S. I was born in Hong Kong, but I grew up mostly here. So I wasn't that foreign student. But I know a lot of people who moved here, and when they move here, a lot of people who are over in Asia and China, when they move here, there's a cultural shock. There's a difference of everything, and so, and they come from a different place. So, and so I can relate to that character in that way, kind of putting up a wall. I'm not sure what I want to do with this whole entire new environment. What is this whole thing? I just wanted to study, get my degree, and be done with that. And what is this whole thing with God and whatever, you know? And it was kind of like, I can understand how he can think, how weird that a guy would actually stand up and confront a professor, because that's just not the culture over there. I mean, I haven't had a lot of time in Asia, in Hong Kong, but I had like 3 years of elementary school there, so I kind of have a sense, you know, the education system is not as open-minded to a certain extent.
Well, there's certainly a pressure
Yeah.
for grades. I mean, I know among, you know,
Oh,
if you
yeah.
come all the way to study in America, you're not there to, you know, play around and just kind of, you know, make sure you go to Disneyland like your character wanted to go.
Yeah, so
I mean, your parents are sending you there to get a degree and to be serious, and so that character, you can feel the pressure that your character is feeling from home.
Exactly.
To quit thinking about all this God stuff and, you know, get to studying.
Yeah, especially if it's going to jeopardize your grade. I mean, why would you risk that at all? It makes no sense to him in the beginning. So it's a really, you know, I think it's a very realistic portrayal of how someone would actually find that a cultural shock and that, you know, new environment, and seeing something like this. It's, you know, so it's kind of like, I remember in the beginning, near the beginning of the movie, there's that scene where Josh is being told by David characters, the pastor, about how you know, this might be the only chance they might have, you know, the students in that class. And I'm always thinking about, like, everything that we do, you never know who's watching. And so, and my character happens to be watching. And that's the thing, is I feel like, you know, you don't know. And so we have to be really, you know, we got to take some form of a stand. And I also remember, like, I kind of actually, personally, I relate more towards Josh's character, because I've had something similar. And I have atheist friends that I'm good friends with them, and we have very interesting intellectual conversations with. When I first told them about the story, and they're like, "Oh, that's preposterous. You know, you can't have a professor that does that." But I'm like, well, I had a TA when I went to college in one of my class who was an atheist, and I was trying to voice certain thoughts into what she was trying to teach, and she really didn't want to hear any of it. But fortunately, she was a TA, so my grades weren't, like, you know, in her hands. I didn't have the professor, but I can imagine what if she does become a professor someday, and she does that. And she actually was, like, when I was talking to her, she was a Christian that turned into an atheist. So it's pretty much like that, the character. You know, so for me, it's like, well, you might think it doesn't exist, but the thing is, I did have something similar, maybe not to that degree, but there are definitely definite cases out there that are like that, and I feel like, you know, it's a real, there is realism in this whole story.